Okay, guys, this is just going to be a quick review of what you already learned in physical science about matter, elements, and compounds. So we know that matter is anything that has mass and takes up space, and elements are the smallest unit of matter that cannot be broken down into any other substances. We also have compounds, and compounds are two or more different elements that are bonded together in fixed proportions. So here are some examples of elements that we will be talking about in ecology. Specifically important ones are mercury and sodium, phosphorus, sulfur as far as pollution goes, and then of course carbon, because all living things are carbon based. Now all elements are made of atoms, and atoms are made up of 6 of protons, which are positively charged and live in the nucleus, neutrons, which are neutral, that live in the nucleus, and electrons, which are negative and that orbit around the outside of the atom. The number of protons in a nucleus is also known as the atomic number, and the number of protons and neutrons in a nucleus is the mass number. Now, if an element has more protons than neutrons and more protons than electrons, then that's going to make it more positively charged. And when that's happened, we call that an isotope. The most important couple of isotopes that we'll be talking about is hydrogen, specifically, is probably the most, and then sodium. So this means it's just going to have extra, I'm sorry, not an isotope, but ions. So I apologize, let me go back. Isotopes are the same element but different number of protons. So really the only one we're going to be talking about here is going to be carbon. Carbon can have additional protons that lend itself to a little radioactivity, and this is what we're going to use to carbon date things. Ions, however, are positive or negatively charged based on whether or not they've gained or lost electrons. If they've gained an electron, they're going to be negative. If they've lost an electron, they're going to be positive. If you have one atom that donates or gives away or loses an electron to another, then those are going to be ionically bonded. They'll be bonded together because of their different charges. And sodium and chlorine are the most common one that we talk about because that is table salt. pH is a measure of acidity. Specifically, it's a measure of hydrogen ions in a solution. So if you look in your notes here, you have 7 is a neutral pH with a pH of 7. Anything higher than that has a large amount of hydrogen ions in it. Anything lower than that has a large amount of hydroxide ions, or OH. Okay. You can also see that one of the things that they have on here is like Tums, which has a pH of 9. And your gastric fluid, or your stomach acid, can have a pH between 1 and 3. And so if we take our stomach acid and then we combine it with baking soda or Tums or milk of magnesia, that's actually going to bring that stomach acid up to a more neutral level. So that's how antacids work, is they go in and they buffer, they gather up those hydrogen ions and make that solution more basic so that it doesn't burn your esophagus. Again, this is from our case study in the previous class where we talked about deforestation. What we noticed is that you have a high concentration of nitrates in your disturbed watershed. So when we take away all of these plants, we're actually going to have a huge amount of nitrate that is going to flow into the water, which means it's going to leave the area where plants need to grow, and we need nitrates for plants to grow. All right, so if you have 2 or more atoms held together by a chemical bond, that's called a molecule. If you get a whole bunch of these different types and you bond them together, you can have a compound. And there are 2 types. that we're really going to focus on ionic, which is like where we take two ions, one that's gained an electron, one that's gained an electron, one that's lost an electron, and we put them together, and they're bonded because opposites attract. So in this case, you have sodium and chloride, and they are bonded together because sodium is positive, chlorine is negative, and that makes an ionic bond. Compounds which share electrons. So carbon has 4 protons, 4 electrons. That means it actually can make 4 chemical bonds. When you have 4 chemical bonds, it is going to share 4 electrons with 4 different hydrogen, and that is called a covalent bond or a covalent compound. Then when we show what this looks like, we're going to have carbon and hydrogen, and what we want to tell everyone is that carbon, there's 1 carbon, and then that 1 carbon is going to attach to 4 hydrogens. This is an example of a chemical formula because the chemical formula is going to tell you what elements are there and how many. And so we're going to use a lot of different chemical compounds we're going to be talking about. And when we talk about them, just know, like this tells you, sodium hydroxide tells you that there's 1 sodium, 1 oxygen, 1 hydrogen. Glucose tells you there's 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. Organic compounds, this is a lot, there's a lot of words on the screen, but basically organic compounds are compounds that involve carbon. Okay, and that's why I think at the very beginning, when we first started talking about what is, living on the earth, is that we have to have carbon in order to have life. So when scientists are looking for life on other planets, they're really looking for carbon compounds. And so we're going to talk specifically about a couple of, or 4 really important carbon compounds that we call macromolecules. So the first one that I want to talk about is, I'm going to go this way, is carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are our quick energy source, and carbohydrates start out, the monomer or the lowest form of a carbohydrate is a sugar, which is C6H12O6. When you take all of those sugars and you put them all together, you end up with a polysaccharide. Poly means many, saccharide means sugar. So a mini sugared organism that is going to be like this potato is a polysaccharide, or whole wheat is a polysaccharide. But when you start breaking down these carbohydrates into disaccharides or oligosaccharides, which are just smaller versions, they become less and less, they become quicker and quicker to use up for energy, and therefore they are not good for long-term energy, right? But starches are going to be better because we break down each individual sugar for energy. If we have all of these sugars, it's going to take us that much longer to break these bonds, then break the sugar down, break these bonds, then break the sugar down. So the first thing on this page says complex carbohydrates contain 2 or more monomers, and a mono just means 1, of simple sugars linked together. So that's what I just showed you. The next thing on here is proteins are formed by linking monomers of amino acids. So let's look at that one. Amino acids, there are 20 amino acids. All 20 amino acids make up every single protein in your body, in an organism. Every amino acid. Amino acids are called that because they have an amine group which has nitrogen, and then they usually have some kind of side group which is going to have the characteristics of that amino acid. When you take a chain of amino acids and put them together, we call it a polypeptide. Then when you put a bunch of those chains together, that's a protein. Okay, so let's go back. Proteins are formed by linking amino acids together. That's how you make a protein. You link amino acids together, and then you take that chain and link it with other chains and form a protein. The next thing we'll talk about is nucleic acids. They are made of sequences of nucleotides that are linked together. So if you look in this picture, we have 1 nucleotide, which is made up of a phosphate, a 5-carbon sugar, and a nucleotide base. And you'll remember from biology, your bases are adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. That's just back from biology. So we have a phosphate, a sugar, and a nucleotide base. That's your nucleotide. So that's the monomer of DNA and RNA, which are our genetic material. Okay, so that is this one. Nucleic acids are linked together to make sequences of nucleotides, and those sequences are either RNA or DNA. And then the last thing is a lipid. So a lipid contains these fatty acids. They're just long chains that hang down like this. When you put 3 fatty acids together and attach them, you get a fat molecule, also known as a triglyceride. Tri means 3, glycer means fat. So these are 3 fatty acids attached to each other. And when you do that, you end up with fat cells just like that. So there are 4 macromolecules that you have to know: carbohydrate, lipid, nucleic acid, and protein. Okay, so all matter comes through cells. And so cells are the fundamental units of life, and all organisms are composed of cells. Within the cells, you have a nucleus. Inside the nucleus, you have DNA. DNA contains the instructions for proteins. And those proteins make our traits. And our traits are like hair color, eye color, skin color, everything that makes you you, right? Are you going to have a lot of hair? Are you not going to have a lot of hair? Are you going to have earlobes that are attached to the side of your head, or you're going to have free hanging earlobes? Are you going to have a widow's peak or not a widow's peak? There's tons of things. And all of that comes from the proteins that are encoded in our DNA. Now, chromosomes are basically a whole bunch of genes. So genes are segments of DNA, and segments of DNA come together and form chromosomes. And each chromosome of course, has DNA. You have 1 chromosome from each parent, 1 from mom and 1 from dad. And so that's how we get our traits. But also we have 23 sets of chromosomes, but even fruit flies have sets of chromosomes, right? So anything that's living has some kind of genetic information that it must pass on to its offspring. The other thing about matter is that matter can either be highly concentrated or not. Okay, so you can have high quality matter, which is typically located near the Earth's surface, right? It is highly concentrated, and the more concentrated the matter is, so when I say highly concentrated, I mean typically solid. So solids are highly concentrated matter, and they have a high potential to be a good energy source. Okay, like coal is highly concentrated carbon, and that means it's going to make a good energy source. Whereas something that's diluted, which is in the form of a gas or in a solution, has a low potential to be a resource and is not very widely distributed. Matter can undergo physical, chemical, or nuclear changes. I think you know what physical is. This just basically means it's going to go from a solid to a liquid to a gas, or the other way around. And so it's going to change its physical shape, but not the chemicals. A chemical change is the result of a chemical reaction in which you will have elements that react together and form products. And this is actually going to change the chemical composition of what you're looking at. Okay, so these 2 changes you should have done for sure in physical science. Talked about chemical and physical changes. The next one, though, nuclear changes. This is where you actually change the nucleus of an atom. So radioactive decay occurs when the nuclei of unstable isotopes, remember isotopes are things that are the same element but different proton numbers, they spontaneously emit fast-moving chunks of matter, high energy radiation, or both. And when that happens, it basically can emit both of these things. It can emit alpha particles, gamma rays, or beta particles. And so that's radioactive decay. Nuclear fission is basically where we take certain isotopes and split them apart into lighter nuclei. So we're taking the nuclei of the atom and we're splitting it. That's what fission means, splitting. Nuclear fusion is the opposite. We're slamming 2 nuclei of atoms together, and we're trying to fuse them together. And that once we do that, it just releases a huge amount of energy. So the last thing we have to talk about matter is the law of conservation of matter. basically what this says is matter cannot be created or destroyed. Okay, so we don't create atoms, we don't destroy atoms. However, we can change them by physical change or chemical change, but we cannot eliminate